I'm making a legendary longsword that sold for $65,000. Starting over is an option I cannot afford. So sit back, grab some popcorn, and enjoy this 4.5 month build.
What you're looking at is the sketch for EXCELSIOR.
The first thing we need to do is get our billets heated up and forge welded together. I'm starting with so much steel that I actually have to make 2 separate billets, and we'll combine them later on in the Damascus making process. After forge welding the billet together, I grind the sheet metal off the outside of the billet. The reason I had sheet metal on the outside of the billet was to keep oxygen from getting inside the billet. It protects it from the atmosphere, so I get very clean, beautiful forge welds. Making the Damascus is one of my favorite parts of knife making because I get to use my giant hydraulic press that my dad and I built years and years ago. This thing smashes hot metal and just stretches it out. It's so much fun to run. After grinding the scale off and cutting the pieces to length, we can then stack them back up to multiply the layers. For this particular pattern, I also want to add in an extra piece of 1084. This will add a nice dark line that'll separate the 2 pieces of billet. That way I can temporarily get the pieces held in place with the CA glue, more permanently hold them in place with the MIG welder, and then permanently hold them in place with forge welding. I get the billet back in the forge, heated up for forge welding, more grinding, and more drawing out. For the next forge welding operation, we're going to take 4 of these pieces and do what's called a 4-way, where we put all 4 of them side by side instead of stacked on top of each other, and that'll create a mosaic picture on the end of the bar. That'll look something like a little explosion or starburst on the end of the billet.
Now that we forge welded all that together and re-squared it on a 30-degree angle, it's looking very similar to the next stage of my drawing. You can see the center line coming up through here, not quite coming out at the corners. And then these other lines coming off to the edges represent the center of our very starting billet. I've been working on this mosaic Damascus for 6 days straight, and it's almost ready to have its final forge welding session done to it. Right now I've got the bar surface ground, and I've also ground the edges clean, and we're ready to start cutting it up into tiles and tile welding this. It'll probably get cut up into about 16 or 17 individual tiles, and that's how we'll get the pattern of the mosaic. onto the surface of the blade. I want to show you how we want to fold the pattern and get the pattern from the end of the billet into what will be the sides of the blade. The way I like to do this is just start by moving first piece kind of where I want it and then go on down.
And now our tile mosaic billet is ready for the final forge weld. This is the most critical forge weld of the entire project, and it's also one of the hardest to pull off. After several hours of forge welding the pieces and drawing out the billet in the hot July Missouri heat, I have yet to find out if we got perfect forge welds on all the tiles, but we won't know if it's actually good until I grind into the billet later on.
The next thing we need to do is get this blade normalized. I would like to introduce Kevin, the Minion Forge. Let's get EXCELSIOR in the forge and get it up to our first normalizing temperature of 1600 degrees. I brought it into the dark room here and you can really see it's got a nice even color on it.
All right, I gotta hang this thing up. I'm getting, that's hot. That's hot, that's real hot. Guys, move it. I'm about to burn up here. Yeah, burn up Kyle. Here, come fill my pants.
Burn Kyle, everyone
Feel that.
pants.
Ow! You're like, oh, I'm hot. I bet your pants aren't that hot.
I'm done normalizing the blade, so now I have a lot of grinding to do. And by a lot, I mean a whole lot.
I'm using my 1958 Benton Harbor, Michigan Coville surface grinder to surface grind this sword. The problem is the table is only 18 inches long and this sword blade is 37 inches plus like a 10-inch tang. In order to surface grind the blade, I have to do small sections and overlap previous sections with the next section that I'm doing and slowly but surely get the whole blade surface ground as flat as I can.
Let's pull it out and take a look and have our first reveal of the finished pattern.
I think it came out absolutely amazing. It looks like our tiles forge welded together beautifully as well.
Guys, I'm super on edge right now because this is the final stage to where the sword could be destroyed. I've spent 2 weeks working on this thing so far. There's things that could happen out of my control and cause me to have to restart. It's time to put it in the forge, heat it up, and then we're gonna quench it in Parks 50. We've got a big old long tube so we can fit the entire sword in there and get it hardened up. This is where it all comes down to the wire though, and we could end up cracking the blade or not hardening it properly, or something right now could make it so we have to restart on this blade. Our blade's been soaking at 1550 degrees for a few minutes now. We're finally ready. It's the moment of truth. I'm gonna pull it out, get it into the Parks oil as quickly as possible, and I'm gonna violently try to move it up and down to help break that vapor barrier and get it to quench nice and quickly. It's warped.
The blade did warp during heat treatment. Later on, after tempering, we'll tackle the warpage issue and try to get the blade straightened out using some heat. The brown color with a little bit of purple mixed in was the coloring from tempering the blade. Tempering the blade takes out a little bit of the hardness, but it makes it much, much tougher and less likely to chip and break.
And now is the time to start straightening the blade.
To do this, I heat up only the center of the blade, and then I apply pressure in whichever direction I want to undo the warp in. I hold it in place and cool it off with a little bit of water. This, over time, will fix the warping issues. Sometimes I can straighten a section after one cycle, but sometimes it fights you and you have to do it over and over and over again before you finally get it.
Excelsior is looking really good. I was actually able to get her nice and straight without too much effort. Now actually the next thing we need to do is get the blade profiled.
I roughed in the profile of the blade before heat treatment, but now that the blade's hardened and tempered, it's time to finalize the profile.
Here it is, we've got Excelsior profiled. It's really starting to look like my sketch now, and it's kind of exciting. I got the layout for the fuller onto the blade on both sides. We can go ahead and take it over to the grinder, and I'm gonna use a 1-inch wheel and start grinding in this fuller.
Grinding in this fuller by hand is one of the most difficult grinding operations I've ever done on any project. The sword is pretty heavy at this stage, and I have to hold the whole thing horizontally. It's not bad when you're grinding out in the middle, but when you're grinding towards one of the ends, your arm is holding the whole weight of the sword way out there, and it became very tiring. One tiny mistake could end up leaving a big ding or gash in the fuller, and it would ruin the look of the blade. I hand sand the fuller using the same round wheel that I used to grind in the fuller. The only difference here, I'm running it side to side manually, and it has sandpaper wrapped around it.
I got the fuller ground in. I spent 2 days grinding on it. I also spent probably a full-blown day hand sanding the fuller. Got my lines on the edge of the blade about 40 thousandths of an inch apart. We're ready to get all geared up. I'm gonna wear a respirator, glasses, earplugs. We're gonna have a ventilation fan. I'm also gonna be wearing a hat because I'm gonna be doing some really heavy grinding and I wanna keep those hot sparks off the top of my head. We'll start going crazy on this thing. I spent 2 full days grinding on this blade. It has been tremendously difficult. It's kind of like grinding a dagger, only really, really long, because this blade is 37 inches. We got a little pattern made of the guard, and I'm just gonna outline around the pattern onto my anvil, just so we can forge that piece of metal that's gonna be the guard. We need to forge the lugs down a little bit. There we go. I can now use the torch and heat up the ends of that guard and forge them down this way.
After forging out the general shape of the guard, I let it cool down in my heat treating oven. Then we can move on to grinding the shape further to get it closer to what I have on my sketch. Something really satisfying about removing this metal from the guard. Seeing the guard slowly take shape, all that extra metal around the edges slowly disappearing and turning into fiery sparks.
Got the entire guard profiled as far as I'm going to take it for now. It's ready to move on to fitting onto the sword blade. Finally, that time, we need to make a big long groove through this 5.5-inch long piece of premium interior mammoth ivory. This thing is gorgeous. There's no checks or cracks or anything. And I really want to make sure I don't mess it up because this thing was something like $800 and I don't have another one. We've got our front spacer fitting and roughly profiled in. We've got our handle material fitting and not profiled in. The next thing is to move on to the pommel. To the pommel, not to the pommel, it's to the pommel.
I grind a long section of the tang into a 1/4-inch round rod. This section of the tang will go into the pommel and it'll have threads on the end so the pommel nut can thread onto the tang. Now that the tang is ready for the handle, we can begin working on the pommel. I take a large round bar of mild steel and begin cutting away everything that doesn't look like the pommel. Once I get the shape roughed in with a carbide cutter, I clean everything up with a die grinder and files. Next, we can begin working on the front spacer. I've already fit the front spacer to the tang, but it's still a big chunky piece of metal that needs quite a bit of material ground off of it. The shape of the front spacer is going to be a lot of work to create. It's not just going to be a flat oval front spacer. Because of all those curves, it's going to be a lot of work to shape it that way, and it'll be a lot of work to hand sand it and clean it up later too. The front spacer and pommel are shaped. Let's move on to our fossilized mammoth ivory handle. I give myself a few guidelines to follow, and from there I manually shape everything else in, using those guidelines to make sure I keep things symmetrical. With the handle shape, it's time to finalize the shape of the guard. We've already got the profile of the guard finished out, but we have another dimension of shaping we need to do, and there's quite a bit of extra material to start hogging off.
I have the guard completely shaped. Let me tell you, this thing is beautiful. I'm loving the way this sword is looking. The guard was the last thing that we had to really get shaped on here, and now it's really starting to look like a complete sword.
Now that all the handle components are shaped, it's time to start adding embellishments. The way we're going to embellish the mammoth ivory handle is by adding a bunch of straight flutes all the way around the handle. I've never done this type of straight fluting before, and I didn't realize how much work it was going to be to do. I start by giving myself a layout for all the flutes. With the layout complete, I begin cutting in each flute one at a time with a small file. Once the center of all the flutes have been cut in, I can begin rounding all the flutes over to make them have this really nice rounded look. Shaping the flutes was only half the story. Getting them finished out and removing all the file marks was the other half. It took a long time to hand sand each one of these flutes and get them ready for polishing.
I don't know about you guys, but I need a break from all this filing and hand sanding and fluting. I think it's time to go slice a couple pumpkins and maybe have a stab at a soda bottle. That pumpkin cutting was pretty terrifying. On one of those cuts, I think I had the blade tipped on a little bit of an angle and it caught onto the pumpkin and kind of drew the sword blade up as I was kind of going down. And if you look back at the video and slow it down super slow, frame by frame, you can see that blade like flexing like this, like serpentine. It was going up and down at the same time. But it did its job. It stayed there. The blade is basically tempered like a spring, so it's technically made to move quite a bit, and it's pretty thin. We're ready to move on to doing the gold inlay on the fittings. To start out with, for the front spacer, we need to get a good layout for the very center of the front spacer, and then the center going this direction as well, so I can get my name centered up on there really well. Got a bad feeling about this. Oh, please be good. Please be good. It's gonna look like just a big blotch of mud on the wall. Oh, it worked. Oh, it actually worked. It looks pretty good. Oh, I'm so glad that worked. Oh, man.
I could have manually laid out each letter of my maker's mark on the front spacer and then engraved them one at a time. I thought it'd be a little easier though if I used a stencil and electrochemically etched my maker's mark into the front spacer and then used that marking as a guideline so I could easily come back in with my gravers and make everything deeper for the gold inlay. I used a flat graver on all the straight sections to make the grooves deeper for our gold inlay, and then I use a high-speed dental burr that turns at 320,000 RPMs to deepen any sections that have a lot of curve to them. I use the dental burr on the curved sections because the flat graver won't be able to turn very tight on any of these curved sections, and it would leave a really dirty, nasty looking groove. Once the grooves are nice and deep, I dovetail all the grooves. That's what'll hold the gold in place. You'll smash the gold into the dovetails, it'll fill it out and mechanically hold it there permanently. Next is my favorite part of doing inlay, and that's the inlay part itself. It's so satisfying to smash the soft 24 karat gold into place. I love doing gold inlay where it wraps around a piece and you have a seam where the two ends meet each other. You smash the gold together right at the seam, and when you're all done and everything's cleaned up and sanded, the seam is completely invisible and it looks like one solid piece of gold going all the way around the spacer. Now it's time to focus some more attention to the blade. Our blade has been ground and hand sanded, but it has not been etched yet to reveal the Damascus pattern. First, I clean the blade off really well, and then I etch it in a water and ferric chloride solution for 5 to 10 minute cycles. After each one of those cycles, I take the blade out, sand all the oxides off with 3000 grit sandpaper, and then put it back in the ferric chloride solution for another cycle.
Two or three more cycles like that, and this blade should be fully etched and ready to move on to polishing and coffee darkening after that.
The ferric chloride solution eats away one type of steel in our Damascus pattern, the 1084. The 15 and 20 is the other type of steel, and it has a little bit of nickel in it. The nickel resists the ferric chloride etch and keeps it shiny and bright. Whereas the 1084 turns dark and etches deeper and deeper the longer I keep it in the ferric chloride. After spending a couple days etching the blade and getting the coffee darkening finish to come out just right, here is our finished etched sword blade. I think it looks absolutely phenomenal. I could not be more pleased with how this mosaic pattern came out. And since it's a sword blade, there's a whole lot of it to enjoy.
My layout is done, so we can start filing in the scallops. I've already sort of roughed in 2 of them so far. We've got 16 to do in total. I like to start at the very corner and just make a nice little nick right on my line, and that gives me a good starting place to go so my file doesn't slide all over the place, and then I can slowly start adding more and more pressure.
If you're interested in how I went from a homeschooled kid making my first knife at 14 years old to making the knives and swords I'm making today, then subscribe to my email list where we talk about just that. Link is in the description. After finishing up the scallops on the end of the pommel, it's time to do the 24 karat gold inlay on the pommel.
I am finally done with all of Excelsior's gold inlay. This pommel was the last piece to do and all the gold is in. We just need to start sanding on all the fittings now. I am done hand sanding the fittings. All that needs to be done on them is for them to be buffed and blued. And a lot can go wrong here, and if it does go wrong, you gotta sand all the bluing off and re-sand your fittings, and it can be a pain, so I'm hoping it goes really well.
As you may know, my mom, dad, and brother work with me. My knives are providing for 3 households. When we took this custom sword order, we took a lot of risks knowing it would be such a long project. The financial pressure to finish was at its peak here in these last days. Making this sword could break us. So many things could go wrong with the build of this caliber, and starting over is an option we cannot afford. Oh, baby. Oh, it's so good. It's so pretty. Oh, I'm so glad I redid the pommel to get rid of those micro scratches now. Oh, man.
All the bluing is done, and I've sharpened EXCELSIOR's blade. One more thing we've got to do, and that's to assemble all the pieces, and EXCELSIOR is done. I've got all the parts cleaned up, inspected, everything's good to go.
This is such a surreal moment for me. I can't believe EXCELSIOR is almost finished. I've spent 4.5 months working on this sword for 8 to 12 hours a day, and it's almost done.
EXCELSIOR is finally done. I got all the tape off, I cleaned it up. I have spent 4.5 months working on this sword. The longest sword project I've ever done. The previous sword was about 3 months. This one took a little longer because it was fancier, and oh boy. It's just about the right weight to where you can hold it with one hand and wield it. It'd be a little unwieldy with one hand, or you can get both hands on there because there's enough handle to fit both of your hands for sure. I got the blade nice and thin. We've got a nice taper all the way down the blade. I'm so happy with how the Damascus came out too. This mosaic is just so cool looking. The balance point is about 6 inches in front of the guard, which is exactly where I was wanting it.
4.5 months. It took longer than I expected, but wow, was it worth it. It was such a great learning experience, and I couldn't be more pleased with how this sword came out. I absolutely love it. I will see you in the next video. May the forge be with you. Bye-bye! If you enjoyed this video, check out this one, where I show you how I make my first ever sword.